We are on the draw here with a 3 Infect creature hand. Gonna keep it. Technically, it's 4 Infect creatures when you count in the Inkmoth Nexus. So our opponent's leading on a basic island. And we drew pretty much the worst card we could possibly draw in the second Pendlehaven here. So gonna start and lead off on one of our Pendlehavens to play this Glistener Elf. And okay, interesting, a Thought Scour. Wasn't really expecting that one. So that could mean that our opponent's on something like Storm. There's various builds of Storm, but it looks like we are playing against most likely the more traditional version of the Storm deck. And our opponent has a pretty good draw here. Turn 1 Thought Scour, turn 2 Goblin Electromancer. But we're gonna go ahead and attack, and I think we may actually want to pump our Glistener Elf here with the Pendlehaven, just to maximize the amount of Infect damage we're dealing. So gonna go ahead and do that, and the reason why I like this play is because we can also play another Glistener Elf here. We're definitely vulnerable to a lot of our opponent's potential cards. Grape Shot would be one of the worst cards we could see here. But our opponent could also just go off. We don't know the texture of our opponent's hand. Goblin Electromancer is one of those cards that allows you to just kind of have these goldfish draws where he can just go Ritual, Past in Flames, Manamorphose, and then win from there. So yeah, here's a Desperate Ritual, and that's gonna create 3 red. So if our opponent does have a Manamorphose, looks like that is the case. So the Manamorphose is probably gonna create 2 blue, 2 red, and now here's a Ravings. So yeah, our opponent's kind of just... This is basically the nut draw for the Storm deck. We were on the draw, so we didn't really have a chance to even try to win this game. And it looks like we might even just lose this turn, depending on what our opponent decides to go with here. And it could be that our opponent just gasses back up and tries to go off again next turn. So this Serum Visions may scry some stuff to the top. Then the Desperate Ravings could get flashed back, and all of a sudden we're in just as bad of a spot next turn, assuming we don't have a way to win, which it looks like we probably wouldn't be able to kill our opponent on our next turn. If we had more creatures in our graveyard, it would be a different story, but we don't. So we see what our opponent's discarding here. And when playing from the other side of the Storm deck, you're just kind of like, I'm probably dead. Okay, so our opponent's playing Pyromancer's Ascension, but we don't know for sure that we're dead. So we are getting to untap here, which is a good sign. And we're just going to continue trying to put the pressure on. That's really our only choice at this stage. So our opponent's going to take 3 Infect. We can't actually kill our opponent this turn, which is pretty unfortunate, but going to go ahead, deploy Blighted Agent, and pass the turn. And just going to have to cross our fingers here that we're not dead. So this Thought Scour is pretty good. It's going to put a counter on the Pyromancer's Ascension. And our opponent does still have 4 cards in hand. And there's another Thought Scour. So now the Pyromancer's Ascension is fully loaded. There's 2 counters on it. So if our opponent has something like a Manamorphose, that's going to be bad for us. But our opponent's already pretty much got a ton of spells in their graveyard, so almost anything is going to be bad news for us here. Especially something that draws cards. Alright, so Pyretic Ritual. That's going to get copied. So since our opponent has gone for this ritual, we got to think our opponent might have something like a Past in Flames, or something that's going to draw cards. But we also know about Desperate Ravings in the graveyard, so that could also be the plan, to just flash back Desperate Ravings in this spot. So yeah, it looks like the play is going to be flashing back Desperate Ravings, which is going to put 2 copies of Desperate Ravings on the stack. It looks like our opponent did draw a Manamorphose. So now that's going to create 2 blue, and that was basically exactly what our opponent was looking for. It's pretty hard to see any sort of scenario where our opponent is not going to be able to combo off here. So looking at our opponent's graveyard, all of the Desperate Ravings look to be gone. So if somehow all of the card draw effects are at the bottom of our opponent's deck, it's technically possible we could win. But it looks like, yeah, here's a Manamorphose. And once we see something like a Past in Flames, we'll know the writing's completely on the wall at that point. And the sleight of hand is going to allow our opponent to now dig through and find exactly if there's 1 card missing from the combo perspective. And we're basically helpless at this point. So yeah, here's a ritual. And at this point, our opponent should have pretty much gone through their whole deck, so I can't imagine that that grape shot or what have you wouldn't have been found at this point. Alright, here's a Desperate Ravings. That seems like a little bit risky to cast, but now we see that there is a Past in Flames in our opponent's graveyard. So basically, and we also see the grape shot. So what our opponent can now do is Past in Flames and then rebuy this grape shot. So we'll let our opponent go through the motions, but we should be dead here. So yep, here's the grape shot. Basically, essentially, is going to create 1,000,000 copies because of all of the spells our opponent has cast this turn. And these can just all go to our face. So now I am going to go ahead and concede the game. And we'll go to our sideboard. So thinking about that game, we really would have liked to have an answer for the Electromancer. And just more interaction in general. So I think what we want to do is board in some of our counter magic here to try to disrupt what our opponent is doing. So I think Spell Pierce is pretty good. Definitely our opponent can have enough mana to be able to get past this, but countering an Ascension or a key spell seems very good for us, and then also Dispel. So Dispel can counter the rituals, the Manamorphoses, stuff like that. We also likely want Nature's Claim, which can blow up the Pyromancer's Ascension. And then we may even want Dismember as well, just to be able to deal with Goblin Electromancer. So that's a lot of cards to bring in. So we've got to decide what we want to take out, of course. Twisted Image and Distortion Strike seem cuttable. Our opponent is not playing that many creatures, so these cards don't do as much as we would really want them to be doing. And so I think cutting those is completely reasonable. Mutagenic Growth is another card I think we can look at cutting. So is Apostle's Blessing, actually. And we may want to consider the Wild Defiance in the sideboard as well. So I think cutting at least a couple Mutagenic Growths is fine. We want to keep in all of our Become Immenses, our Vines of Vastwoods, our Might of Old Crozas, and the Groundswell. The Mutagenic Growth seems like the weakest of those cards. Apostle's Blessing doesn't seem all that necessary because our opponent isn't going to have that much removal. Maybe Lightning Bolt, maybe Grape Shot. So this actually seems like a pretty solid configuration to me. So let's go with it. We are on the play here for game 2. And unfortunately, there's just no keeping this hand, so gonna go to 6, and we can keep the 6, definitely. Pretty much on the Blighted Agent plan. And so we are gonna get a Scry. Interestingly enough, it's a Dismember that we're seeing on top, which is a card we want if our opponent has Goblin Electromancer. But I think we just want to go ahead and bottom it because first of all, we don't know if our opponent has Electromancer, and we also would rather just be able to draw a land here, be able to play Noble Hierarch and Blighted Ancient, and then potentially actually just kill our opponent on our 3rd turn is best case scenario. So now that our opponent's played a Gitaxian Probe, also they are going to be aware of the Spell Pierce, so we have to be very ready to have the Spell Pierce not be as good as we would like it to be. And if our opponent has the opportunity to kill the Blighted Agent, I'm guessing they will opt to do that as aggressively as possible. So this is probably going to be a Slight or a Visions. It's going to be a Visions, okay. And this is a pretty typical Storm start. And there's our land. So now we have a bit of a decision. Our opponent knows we have the Spell Pierce, but we can still hold it up if we want to here. And I think that's a reasonable choice, is to hold up the Spell Pierce in case of Pyromancer's Ascension. Alright, let's try this line of holding up Spell Pierce. It may definitely backfire on us because our opponent knows about the Spell Pierce. But we can play our Noble Hierarch next turn. But now, of course, our opponent has the Goblin Electromancer. The card we were essentially hoping was not in our opponent's hand, considering the way we played this game. And here is a Vines of Vastwood, which was a great draw for us. So we can actually now just go for the turn 3 win, which is the reason why we scryed, why we earlier scryed that Dismember to the bottom, is to maximize the potential of winning on turn 3. So the Might of Old Kroza is going to go on the Blighted Agent, and now we can cast Vines with Kicker as well, and that's actually just going to be 10 poison coming across. And that's something that this deck can do, is you just want to maximize, especially on the play, maximize your nut draw. And so we were able to do that even with keeping up mana for Spell Pierce on our third turn. Or sorry, on our second turn. We were able to go turn 1 Noble, turn 2 Blighted Agent, leave up a land for Spell Pierce, turn 3 kill our opponent after they played the Electromancer. So that was pretty impressive there. But that's just something that this deck can do. We didn't have a great draw in game 1, and we were also on the draw. So here we had a much better draw, and being on the play definitely helps. So the question is, do we want to make any changes for game 3? And I don't think we actually do. I think this is a pretty solid configuration. If it was good for game 1, I mean for game 2, why wouldn't it be for game 3? So we're going to go with it. Now, unfortunately, this hand is a little bit slow. It's got an Inkmoth Nexus in it, and the Dispel is nice. The Dismember could be used for removal on Electromancer, and we do have the one Infect threat in Inkmoth Nexus, plus Become Immense and Fetches. So I think I am going to keep it. It's not your typical explosive hand. It's a hand where our opponent's also on the mulligan, but we can hope to play a little bit of a grindier game and then just win with Become Immense once we get these fetch lands into the graveyard and we start really filling up our graveyard. But if our opponent has a turn to Pyromancer's Ascension, that's definitely going to be bad news for us. Alright, so we drew a probe, so now we can really get a much better idea of what our opponent's working with. And it looks like our opponent has quite a good hand here. So Ascension, a Probe, a Bolt, and a Ritual. Yeah, that's pretty much about as good as you can ask for. Not what we wanted to see, but I think I want to play this Inkmoth Nexus now, and with the idea of potentially attacking with it next turn. The one good thing going for us is that we didn't see in our opponent's hand a real way to we didn't see multiple copies of any one instant or sorcery, so it's going to become a question of if our opponent can actually turn on this Pyromancer's Ascension or not. Noble Hierarch, that's not a bad draw for us. So we could play it right here. And I think that's a reasonable choice to make. But we can also just attack with the Nexus. I think both options have merit. But for me, the best play here is the Noble Hierarch, just so we're going to have more mana next turn. Now, this is going to allow our opponent to potentially use the bolt on that we know about on the Hierarch, but then that's going to mean that the bolt's gone on a creature that does not have Infect. But it looks like our opponent has drawn another way, has drawn at least one way to get a counter on the Ascension. So now we're kind of hoping that there isn't an additional way that our opponent has in hand in order to do that. And right now, the Dismember, and there it is, the second copy of Seer Visions, pretty much exactly what our opponent was looking for here. And I actually would expect our Noble Hierarch to get bolted, but we'll see. So the Ascension has 2 counters on it. Now we actually have to respect the fact that our opponent can copy their Lightning Bolt. So the Bolt actually might not get used for that reason. Our opponent also has a Ritual in hand, so not knowing what's going on, our opponent could even try to go off this turn. We just don't know. But drawing the Probe and the Visions was definitely not good for us. We did not want that to happen. Alright, well that is a good draw. So we drew Nature's Claim here. And we can just go ahead and fire it off on the Pyromancer's Ascension and then see kind of if our opponent decides to then cast Lightning Bolt or not. So yeah, I like this play. So let's go ahead and cast Nature's Claim. And this was the ideal time to draw it. Our opponent might want to Lightning Bolt away our Hierarch. We'll see. Alright, so yeah, there is a Lightning Bolt, and the Bolt is going to be copied. So our Hierarch is going to hit the bin, but on the bright side, what this allows us to have happen is the Pyromancer's Ascension is down, and we've got 4 cards in our graveyard, so this Become Immense is starting to look more and more like 1 mana +6/+6, basically. So now we have the decision of whether we want to hold up the Dispel. So I like playing the Pendelhaven here and actually just going ahead and getting in for the maximum amount of damage, just because we can potentially win next turn with only the cards we have in hand. So we're going to get in for 2 Infect, 2 poison damage right now, and then next turn we can do the same plus add 6 to that with the Become Immense. So that would actually be lethal, and that's what we're representing on our next turn. So our opponent's going to have to respect that, but if our opponent doesn't have something like a Bolt, it's going to be hard to do anything about that. Now, we do know our opponent has a Ritual, but since we were able to get rid of that Ascension, that's going to end up being a really important point here. So the issue now is that our opponent has 1 red mana up, and that 1 red mana is representing Lightning Bolt, the card which we're scared of. So if we activate the Inkmoth Nexus, then activate Pendelhaven to give it +1/+2, and then go for the Become Immense, if our opponent does have Lightning Bolt in that spot, we're in a terrible position. For that reason, I think I like just attacking here and playing it safe. Now, could we lose on our next turn? Yes, it's possible that that could happen. But it's a risk that, personally, I'm willing to take in this spot. Because our opponent doesn't have an Electromancer going or an Ascension. So it's pretty unlikely that we're going to lose this turn. Now our opponent can attempt to try to go off, but we also have this Dispel waiting for interaction. So I actually don't mind just using the Dispel here on the Ritual. Or we can let this Ritual resolve and then potentially counter a following Ritual. All right, so we'll let this Ritual resolve, and we don't even need to use our Dispel yet, because if our opponent does have land plus Lightning Bolt, we still want to have the Dispel for the Bolt. And it's hard to picture exactly what this 3 mana is going to do for our opponent, besides casting another instant, which we can Dispel. And I'm sure our opponent was probably expecting that Ritual to get dispelled, just because our Dispel has been face up because of the Gitaxian Probe, but even with that being said, I like just holding on to it and just playing it conservatively. Now, had we not drawn that Nature's Claim when we did, we very easily would have been in a much, much worse spot. But the Nature's Claim, getting rid of the Ascension, was key. Basically, after board, we have Dismember for the Electromancer, and then we have Nature's Claim for the Ascension. If we're able to keep those cards off the table, we can play more conservatively and protect our Infect creatures much more efficiently. Alright, so now our opponent is actually going for a Manamorphose here. So, pretty interesting spot. We definitely could let this resolve. just because it's going to allow our opponent to have 2 blue, but that's really just going to allow our opponent to cantrip more. So I'm fine with letting the Manamorphose resolve here and just holding on to our Dispel for a little while longer. And also, if we do cast the Dispel, it does add to the storm count. We definitely don't want to get burned out, which is actually a way we could lose if our opponent goes something like Lightning Bolt, Grape Shot, something like that. But the good thing about this situation is our opponent is forced to act. So here's an Electromancer, which our opponent probably didn't want to put into play here. And 1 mana is still in our opponent's mana pool. So we'll see how our opponent wants to go about this turn. Our opponent knows basically that we can win on our next turn. Our opponent also knows that we have Dismember, but the Storm player is pretty much forced to try to play cards out aggressively, and it looks like that is what's going to happen. So here's a Manamorphose. And this Manamorphose, now I think we may just want to counter the Manamorphose. I think I like that play more than... I think the 2 options are casting Dismember on the Electromancer or just using our Dispel. And I think using the Dispel is now the correct play. And we'll see, our opponent may have been sandbagging this 3rd land for a little while now, but it looks like our opponent just didn't have the 3rd land. And so we drew a probe, so we might as well fire off the probe. And we'll see that our opponent has... Okay, our opponent didn't even have the bolt, so it was just Ritual, Electromancer, and Past in Flame. So we played conservatively, and we're still going to win this game. So our opponent is on 4 Infect right now, so we don't need to activate the Pendelhaven. We can just go ahead and fire off this Become Immense. And this Inkmoth is going to get the job done.